This panel is put together in many ways by the Institute of Innovation and Prosecution, which is part of the National Network for Safe Communities. I just want to introduce and recognize Meg Reese, who is here. Just wave your hand so that if people have questions about the Institute, they can they can come talk to her afterwards. Let me just ask a question. How many people who are in the audience are now working or have worked in prosecutors' offices? Just curious to see what the... Yeah, so we got about half of you. Great. Okay, so you know what we're talking about. Everyone knows it in a more slightly removed way, but you're more directly affected. So people who have watched me facilitate panels in the past know that I like to walk around a little bit. In part, there's a trick here, which is to make eye contact with people who go on too long. Because sometimes that happens when you're sitting down here, you can't quite control your eloquent speakers. So we want to make sure their eloquence is also concise. But also it's to really sort of see what's going on in the room and be able to interact with you. So here's the format. We have some time together that will be discussions with our panelists, and I'll introduce them in a second. And at the end of that time, I will commit to you that we will leave at least 10 minutes for questions and answers after we hear from the panel so that you're engaged. So just be ready with your perfectly framed question as we get close to the end of our time. So the connection between this panel and the overall theme of the conference is not perhaps immediately obvious, but doesn't take a lot of thought to realize that prosecutors play a critical role in the justice system. And the question for the panel is, what's the role of prosecutors in a changing criminal justice environment where there's a lot of talk of reform in the air, and where prosecutors are front and center in a lot of those discussions, and how are prosecutors thinking about their role, their posture, their function, and the capacity that they bring to the table for being part of the reform agenda. So the premise here is that the prosecutors are both affected by and can affect the discussions underway in the country. And we're fortunate that we have IIP represented here by Meg, and we're very fortunate that we have the panel that we do that is before us. And I'm looking at this group, and I realize that 3 of you were also at a White House conference, right, on the changing role of prosecutors. So it's a different White House these days, in case anyone hadn't noticed, but there was a lot of energy coming out of the Justice Department and the Domestic Policy Council on this precise topic. So the creation of IIP, the founding of the American Prosecutors Association, the work that Adam Foss is doing, there's just a lot of energy on this topic in the moment. So we are really lucky to have the folks here who are here. So I'm going to introduce them because we do have elected officials here, and this might be a good chance for those who are running for re-election, just to sort of say a few things. But I'll introduce our panel, and we'll get right into it. So starting with the good judge here on my left, her right, is Darcel Clark. Judge Clark is the DA of Bronx County, one of the 5 counties in New York City, and has come into office, safe to say, as a trailblazer, a lot of energy, a firm commitment to reform, a willing, in fact, enthusiastic embrace of the challenges of prosecuting crimes on Rikers Island, which she campaigned saying these individuals there are also my constituents, and that has really just been a jolt of energy in our city, with a lot of support from the city council for the funding that was required, but more importantly, looking at the issues of a speedy trial and other things, some of which came to light in her county in the New Yorker article on Khalil Browder, but is sort of generally a need for a lot of attention in the Bronx. Oh, stragglers coming in. Come on in. So you can look at her bio in your folder if you'd like to. She's also, as I said, been a judge and first African-American prosecutor to take office in New York State. So we're very, very proud of her as a New Yorker with national ambitions and reputations to really make a difference. I don't mean ambitions. I don't mean you're going to run for something. I mean you Darcel, you are bigger than the Bronx. Let me put it that way. You have a big footprint, which is really, really great. To her left, our right, is Cristine DeBerry. Now, Cristine is an unusual prosecutor. First of all, she works for an unusual prosecutor, George Gascon in San Francisco, who himself was not a prosecutor before he became a prosecutor. So there are all these folks coming into your office who have other experiences, which is very valuable. George as a police chief, and Cristine as a defense attorney, also worked for the mayor for a number of years on criminal justice policy issues, and is working with DA Gascon on an agenda that's very reform-oriented, with the goal of reducing the number of people going off to prison and jail from San Francisco. So Cristine, as a former defense lawyer, is just asking heretical questions. Fair? Devil's advocate in-house. So that's really quite wonderful. To her left is Mike Green, known to all of us here in New York City and New York State. Mike was elected DA 2 terms. Yeah, 2 terms, and now serves as as commissioner of the Division of Criminal Justice Services in New York State, appointed by the governor, and in that capacity is responsible for overseeing the disbursement of funds, but really setting policy at the state level in the criminal justice arena, and has been a good friend of mine, good friend of John Jay's for a number of years. We met first when he was doing work as DA in Rochester with David Kennedy's focused deterrence work years ago, but he continues to be an open-minded student of criminal justice reform. So delighted to have the commissioner here. To his left, your right, is Ronald Simpson-Bey, who works for I saw your boss, Glenn Martin, the other night, and I said, Glenn, you are the speedboat, and we're all riding the waves behind you. Glenn is really one of the most important people in our field these days, and JustLeadership USA, which Glenn founded and which Ronald is one of the leaders of, is just making a big difference in our world. And Ronald is a formerly incarcerated individual who's won his appeal based on prosecutorial misconduct. So you have a unique perspective on the role of prosecutors, and I know we'll hear about that. But Ronald and I are sort of on the circuit together, and it's always great to have time to spend with you. And to his left is Carter Stewart. Carter was appointed by President Obama as the U.S. Attorney for what do I say? Central Ohio? Does that sound right? Southern District. Oh, that's Southern District. Right. The other Southern District. So has that experience as a prosecutor in the federal system, and also was in his sort of baby years a prosecutor in San Francisco? San Jose, in California. So has a lot of experience there, but particularly interesting to us is the role that Carter played in the Justice Department on reform initiatives under both Attorneys General Holder and Lynch on children's issues, and the one that I think is the most has the most impact is on racial disparities in the justice system, and he led that task force. So we have a great panel. You want to just give them applause to welcome them for being here? We're going to start out with a question that I highlighted or hinted at in my opening remarks, which is the role of prosecutors in a reform environment. There's just lots of stuff going on in our world, and lots of pressures to maintain the status quo, change the status quo, to change sentencing statutes, to change charging practices. We need only look at what happened recently with the announcement by Attorney General Sessions in terms of going backwards, basically, in terms of charging practices in the federal system, and our colleagues who are working on reducing mass incarceration and trying to find ways to bring down the levels of the numbers of people in prison. When they go into the state legislatures to say, let's do this, let's do that, those legislators often say, well, it depends what the DAs say. So the DAs play a really important role on a case-by-case basis, on a policy basis, and a political basis. And most importantly, DAs run for office. Not all of you have run for office, only 2 of you, Mike and Darcel. So you've been out there talking to folks who then have to cast a vote in our democracy. But I think we all get this. So what is the, and I'll start with Carter. So what do you think is are the cross currents and the pressures on the role of a prosecutor today in an era when there's so much turmoil and so much desire to change things and the sense that we're off on the wrong track? What do you see as the role of prosecutors in that environment?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on this panel. And as Jeremy mentioned, I'm coming from the federal system, so the direction that the federal system, in terms of the U.S. Department of Justice, is going in prior to the election is very different than where it's going now. I was part of the prior administration, and I subscribe to the belief that, in answer to that question, prosecutors have to play a very different role than we played 20, 30, 40 years ago. My colleague Joyce Vance, who's the former U.S. Attorney from Birmingham, Alabama, will recognize this when I say that we subscribe to the policy of the three-legged stool. We think that's the future of prosecutors, meaning that we're not just about prosecution. We have to be more than reactive. You have to do more than just react to crime. We need to be preventative. We need to get engaged in efforts to deter crime in the first place. And we also need to help on the back end when people are coming out of prison to help with reentry. So those are the 3 legs: prevention and deterrence, prosecution, and reentry. Part of that is to reduce crime in the first place, to try to deter it. Part of it is to reduce recidivism when people are coming back to communities. But a large part of that is to build trust, because as any prosecutor knows, you can't build a case unless you have witnesses. And if witnesses don't come forward, if they don't trust you, if they don't like you, then you're not going to be able to win a case. And that's one of the reasons why in certain communities the clearance rate on murder cases, for example, is so low, because of the lack of trust in part. So we absolutely have to build trust. And the last thing I would mention about the future of prosecution is accountability. Whether we like it or not, we are in the era of what I would say is too much information. I mean, younger people today, for example, are putting up way too much stuff about themselves on the web, but there's also an expectation of that from elected officials and from public officials. In the state of Ohio, there's now a system in place whereby every single tax dollar that's spent by the state government is online somewhere. If you want to learn about public schools, you can click on a site and see all the statistics about a public school. You can look at public hospitals online. We're getting to the era where the information about prosecutors' offices, in terms of the numbers of cases, numbers of arrests, the demographics of the people we arrest, how many people we divert, all of that is going to be public information and online, which I think is a good thing in terms of holding us accountable, but it's something that I think is in the future and we should all actually push for in order to build community trust and let folks know how we're doing.
So Carter, we're going to return to this question of accountability and in essence metrics. So accountable for what? What's the results that we should be looking for? But just to mix things up and jump around a little bit, so Cristine, you represent the left coast, as we say, and you're doing all sorts of work within your office to change policy, neighborhood courts diversion programs, and the like. Why? Why are you making those changes? What's the public imperative for you and Mr. Gascon to make those changes?
So I think for D.A. Gascon, certainly for me. No? Is that on now? Okay. He took the appointment to be the district attorney because he wanted to focus on mass incarceration. And he came to that point of view after 30 years in policing, of going from patrol all the way up to the highest levels in the LAPD and realizing that that work wasn't dramatically changing the public safety landscape. That as hard as he and everybody that worked for him was patrolling and policing communities, a lot of what we were doing was relatively futile. And we had incarcerated massive amounts of people and destabilized communities in a way that was actually detrimental to public safety rather than advancing it. And so the question to us then is, what else can we do with these institutions that we have erected to deal with public safety issues if it's not going to be mass incarceration? And so we have been on now a 6-year journey to try and ask ourselves, who do we need to respond to with our interventions, and what should those interventions be? And so the first part of that work was to really try and reduce the amount of noise in the system, right? Because all of us here will tell you we're overwhelmed with the amount of work we have. But when we look at that work, we have to ask ourselves, is this the work I most need to be doing to advance public safety? And I would argue that most misdemeanors and low-level cases do not require the kind of high-expense, high-touch system that we have right now. If you're jaywalking or you have driving under the influence, we need to have a reaction to that, but does it need to be at the level that we do now, where we bring you to a courthouse and we assign you a lawyer, and we have a lawyer for the government, we have a judge oversee that, and potentially a jury, and we spend massive amounts of resources on those cases for an outcome we probably could have gotten without that much process. Most people will say, indeed, the evidence does show I committed that crime, so what I would like to do now is fix my behavior. And so we've erected neighborhood courts where we let the community, we train them, and we let them resolve those disputes without us charging them. And we get much higher completion rate from individuals. They show up more than they do to a traditional court.
What do you mean you allow them to resolve the complaints?
So we train community adjudicators in restorative practices, and we hire a nonprofit to moderate those panels. At the time they're arrested, the police give them a piece of paper that says, you might be eligible for neighborhood courts, call this number. And they call us, and assuming that their record is not dramatically severe and their current offenses qualifies, we will send them to a panel. Some of them meet in the evenings, they meet in community centers all over the city. We have 12 of them now, in the neighborhood where the individual lives. And 3 people from that community have been trained to hear hear from the individual and potentially the victim. It is not a fact finding. You don't go there if you're saying, I was not the guy who spray painted the wall. You come to us then for that. But if you spray painted the wall and you want to make amends, then you go here. We don't charge your case. The community members say, why did you spray paint the wall? He says, I'm an artist. I was contributing to my community. The merchant comes in and says, no, thank you. I don't want that kind of art on my building. And then the community adjudicators decide what the consequence should be for that. And it's restorative. So generally they will have them repaint the wall. If it's something that tangible that can be done, they will have them write a letter of apology. And then in the one individual case, they had them go volunteer at the mural project in the community that taught young people arts in a more productive way. And then we never look at that case again. We consider that closed and resolved. We push as many misdemeanors as we can into that process because we find the offenders are more appreciative of the opportunity to fix the harm that they've caused. The victims are more satisfied with the immediacy of the response. The hearing happens within 2 weeks, and the entire case has to be resolved within 6 months. So it's a very short timeline, which is an important metric we all know in these kinds of cases. Is the immediacy is very lacking from our current system. And it's much cheaper. It's about 1/3 of the cost of gearing up the entire juggernaut of our process. So I would encourage jurisdictions to look at things like this that keep those cases in the community. I guarantee you the prosecutors in your office and the judges prefer that. Nobody wants to deal with those cases. Everyone finds them to be a nuisance. The community cares a lot about them, and they want to be engaged. We have a waiting list for people trying to be adjudicators in that program because so. At any rate, we're trying to cut out misdemeanor cases, low-level cases, and now we're asking ourselves the harder questions about the cases that do need to be in the courthouse, how to respond to those in a way that's more effective.
I'm going to return later to one of my favorite topics, which is how to reduce levels of incarceration, because you said that your DA has taken on that challenge and was one of, if I'm right, one of 2 DAs in California to support Proposition 47. Unusual stance for a prosecutor, so let's hold that thought for a second. So Ronald, in the work that JustLeadership is doing around the country, and you're trying to raise up the voices of those, as Glenn would say, most directly affected, whether it's individuals or their families, and I'm assuming that you're asked from time to time, what's the role of prosecutors in this new world that you want us to embrace and sort of work toward? What do you say?
Oh, that's a powerful question. Thanks for asking.
We didn't come here for a weak question.
No, that's a good one. And you gave me coffee and the microphones. The last time that happened, I talked a dog off a meat truck. But hey, it's all good. For us at JustLeadership, and for me personally, I mean, just to give a little context, Jeremy spoke earlier that I'm formerly incarcerated, but he didn't tell you I spent 27 years in Michigan prison, wrongfully convicted, and my conviction was overturned because of prosecutor misconduct. So I have a vested interest in the prosecutor's role in the community, a vested interest. And I always adopt the saying that Dr. Martin Luther King once said. He said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." The prosecutors are the most powerful player in the arena of criminal justice. So who better to bend that arc of justice toward justice? We need prosecutors to take on that role, to be bold and audacious. Don't settle for incrementalism. We need the prosecutors to come into communities to serve the community. We need to redefine. I always ask prosecutors to redefine what justice is. You know, we all have we have shared values, we have common values, and justice needs to be based on those common values, to be inclusive and not exclusive. It shouldn't be based on color or gender or race or whatever division that we decide to throw at. It should be inclusive of all people. And for far too long, the prosecutors have been, you know, not sensitive to the needs of the community because they're more concerned with the politics that's behind prosecution. They are elected officials, so they're kind of like bellwethers, whichever way the community blows, which is kind of, you know, redundant. They blow the same way. But the prosecutors they're the anchor for our justice, for our democracy. And they could stand up and say, well, we're not going to blow that way because that's not fair. The prosecutor in my case had been reversed 6 times for the same misconduct with the same trial judge. He had a pattern. No accountability. He never faced a board. The court admonished him, but I mean, there was never any sanction. So the prosecutors need to have a more humanistic role in our community, and I think we would be better served if they did so.
Great, thank you. So we have a prosecutor on our panel who's, you know, taking time out from her day job to come down here and help us think about what it means to be an active prosecutor. And you ran for the office on a reform agenda. You have a lot of things on your plate. But when you think about what you have done or have in mind to do or are thinking about doing, what do you think would reflect the sort of the biggest change in from the traditional role of a prosecutor? Something that you have in mind that you would like to do or are now doing that really would set you apart from maybe the way you were brought up in the Bronx DA's office. I think there's a lot of thinking going on here in this room about sort of how we were all trained. What would set you apart from that traditional role?
I think just being a prosecutor that understands that the assistant district attorney I was in the late 80s and through the 90s is not the same type of assistant DA or DA that you can be now. It is very much about the bigger picture. It is about accountability, diversion, reentry, alternatives to incarceration. I mean, when I came up in the system, it was, you're an assistant DA, it was like nail them and jail them. That was your job. You worked with the police. That's what you were supposed to do as a prosecutor. I mean, as the DA now, and I think I have a different perspective because I spent 16 years on the bench presiding over criminal cases for at least 13 of those years and 3 years as an appellate judge. I see it much differently now, having that experience as well as the assistant DA experience now, because I believe in justice, being a justice and a, elected Supreme Court justice and also appellate division judge. My job was always to see things in the middle, to make sure that everything was fair and just. And now as a DA, although some people say, well, you're an advocate, you're supposed to make sure, public safety first and foremost. Well, yes, absolutely, that's my job. But at the same time, I represent all of the community. So that means, and the theme for my office is pursuing justice with integrity. And what I mean by that is I'm going to do what's fair and what's right. And that may mean not charging someone. That may mean diverting them out of the system. That means the prevention programs that my office runs to make sure that young people and people don't enter the criminal justice system in the first place, or partnering with cure violence groups that are out there meeting these young people right where they are before they put their finger on that trigger. It means a lot of those things. And at the same time, it's learning from the mistakes that have been made in the past. So to have a formerly incarcerated person on this stage with me, that would have never happened years ago. We wouldn't even be talking to each other. It's like, why should I talk to him? I said, and as a judge even, I sent a lot of people to state prison. but I look at it differently now. And so that's the way we have to do things as a prosecutor. But first and foremost is the accountability part, and that's what's really different in this reform climate that we have now, to learn from those mistakes. So I established a conviction integrity unit to make sure that I'm not ashamed to review the cases that were done in my office. Even though I wasn't even the DA, you have to own it and take responsibility for those things that are done and learn if there was a mistake. And I've already exonerated 2 people, and I've been in office 18 months. But you have to be able to do that. That makes you a stronger leader to be able to do that. And at the same time, because we are prosecutors and we are the anchor, we have to be accountable. So I also established, and there's none in New York State, and I don't know if in the country, a professional responsibility bureau, where I have a chief that's assigned there to make sure that we have an ethics committee, we have litigation training on, training people, and we have the best practices committee. And all of those are to learn from those mistakes made, as well as if we get a complaint from a judge, from a defense attorney, or something I find is a practice that's happening in my office that shouldn't happen, we review it, and therefore there are consequences to an assistant DA that does those things while I'm the DA.
So, Darcel, let me just ask you how that vision that you just set forth plays against 2 audiences. One is your staff, right? So you'll tell us whether this is, they say, yeah, that's what we signed up for, or it's different, or it's not. And I've heard you talk before about, you do a lot of community meetings, and about the experience of going from one community in one part of your county to another community in another part of your county who have perhaps different expectations of you, and they don't all vote for you, but you're elected to represent all of them, let's put it that way. And so how does it play against that audience?
It's interesting. You have to really go through it to actually see it happen. And I could do it in one night, be in one area of the Bronx where they're like, we got too many police here, you're locking up, you do massive takedowns because of the violence and the drugs, and that wipes out a community. Those are people that are in families, that they're accused of crime, they haven't been convicted, but you're taking them out of the community, and that resources are gone, so you need to replenish them. And then you have others where, the only crimes that are really happening is somebody break into their car, or there's too much traffic, and it was like, we need more police to make sure that the traffic, so it's very difficult. But what happens, and as well as my staff, you inherit staff people who she's out of her mind, and there's a lot of people that left because they weren't on board. And then when you bring in your own, you get the buy-in from the ones that you hire. But in all of those places, you still have to change hearts and minds to let them know the reality of what a DA's office is there for now. So that's why I do, go out into the community, and I meet people that appeared in front of me when I was a judge. I meet people that, were charged by my office now. And for some reason, because I guess the excitement that there's a woman DA now, there's never been a woman DA in the Bronx. I'm the first African-American woman in the whole state. People are excited about that. So I try to use that. I try to use that to use that as my bully put on my platform to let them know that, there's a lot of things that we can do to make the community safe, but at the same time, not infringe on the rights of the accused.
Thanks. So, Mike, I saved you to last. Here's why. You served for 25 years in the DA's office in Monroe County, 8 years as elected DA. You've been now sort of at the pinnacle of criminal justice policy in the state of New York for a number of years, and have, in essence, taken a step back from the prosecutor's role. But you came up in the era that Darcel was just describing, and you ran for office in the era and under some of the frameworks that she was just describing. But you're now looking at all of that through a very different lens, of a policy lens, reporting to the governor with enormous influence over the way criminal justice policy is set in our state, and you've made strategic investments in ideas. How does what we're describing here as the role of the prosecutor look differently from where you sit now?
And again, thank you for having me on the panel. And as Carter said, it's an honor to be on the panel with the people up here. And I think that's a great question. I look back at my time as DA, and certainly I see some very good things I think we did. We worked with David early on, and I think we're a very active partner in a focused deterrence effort at a time when focused deterrence wasn't very popular. We had outreach efforts to the community, for example, through the Boys and Girls Clubs, the DA's offices, at least where I was, had never done before. But I look back and, there's some talk about the rearview mirror this morning. I look in that rearview mirror and I see some things that I did at the time which made a lot of sense to me. And I look at them now through my lens, and they don't look so good. And I'm going to give you two examples that I think will highlight kind of the traditional role that you've heard about and some of my thoughts on what the role ought to be. One was in response to a string of shootings in Rochester. The police chief, who was a very popular police chief at the time, unilaterally announced that there was going to be a zero-tolerance effort, and the police department went on an incredibly aggressive zero-tolerance effort, and it lasted for months and months. And basically, our workload doubled. Arrests doubled. The intake doubled, the number of people going to jail doubled, the number of cases we had to prosecute doubled. And the ultimate effects were that we had thousands of additional arrests, cases, the negative impacts on the neighborhood, less time to focus on the cases and the people we should be focusing on. And as DA, I did what I thought DAs were supposed to do at the time. I had my staff go to court and prosecute all the cases that came through the door. And at the end of the day, it did absolutely nothing to address the problem we're trying to do in terms of reduce the shootings and make the community safer. I won't elaborate, but the second example I look at is in my effort to deal with the historically high rates of shootings and homicides we had in the city of Rochester. I instituted a policy, a no-plea policy on gun cases, and basically sought jail or prison sentences on every gun case. And I look back at those two efforts and I say, what was missing? And in both of those, there was no collaborative effort between all of the law enforcement partners in the community. It was unilateral action. There was no deep analysis of the problem and what exactly was the problem, what was driving it. So there was no, from a research data perspective, deep understanding of the problem before those efforts were instituted. There was no research partner engaged in either of those efforts. Neither of those efforts was an intervention that had been proven in the past to be effective in dealing with the specific problem we were trying to solve. There was no thought of procedural justice in either of those efforts. There was no outreach to the impacted communities to explain what was happening or what we were doing. And in fact, when I look back at the outreach was more talking to other parts of the community about what was going to be done to the impacted community as opposed to an outreach to the impacted community and a dialogue with the community. And then in one case, there was no evaluation at all of the effects of the zero tolerance. With the no plea policy, I did retain a researcher to do an evaluation for me. The researcher did a very nice evaluation, came back and said, yes, you're convicting more people of gun crimes. You're sending more people to jail and prison for gun crimes. And then as a side, he said to me, there's some really good stuff out there now on mass incarceration and the negative effects of it. You ought to take a look at it. And looking back on it, he was absolutely right. And I think it raises a number of interesting questions. From a DA policy perspective, what's the role of the DA as an elected official in a situation like that? Do you stand up, and publicly call the police chief out? Do you work behind the scenes to get the police chief to change course? They're not easy solutions, they're not easy questions, but as Ronald said, if the DA is going to kind of be the anchor of the community, there's got to be some responsibility there beyond just going to court and prosecuting the cases that come through the door. So, how has that shaped what we do? In the funding that we do and in the work that we do, when we look at prosecutors' work, we try and incorporate all of those things into any effort that we're going to support or fund. So they need to be collaborative efforts between all law enforcement partners in the community. And from a procedural justice point of view, I think it's very important too, not just effectiveness, because I don't think the community looks at each player in the system individually to assess whether or not they're procedurally just. I think the community looks at the system, and they either see the system as just or they see the system as not just. So as DA, are you contributing? Are you trying to drive that procedural justice as a partner in this system? Are you doing a deep analysis of your problem? Are you engaging a research partner? Are you looking at interventions that have proven to be effective and looking to use the lessons of those interventions in what you do? Are you considering procedural justice? Are you working with the communities to engage the communities in your effort? Are you evaluating what you do? And those are the types of things that we try and make sure are built into any of the efforts now with prosecutors that we fund or support.
Thanks a lot, Mike. So here we're about to enter what we're going to call the lightning round. So what this means is that you all get a chance to answer a question with a yes or no answer and a 1 sentence, 2 sentence, maybe 3, no semicolons response, so that we can get a lot of stuff out into the air. And the question goes to accountability. And a number of you have talked about accountability. And so there are 3 parts to this question. You can answer any one of these. Should DAs, when they run for office, be held accountable for the number of years that their system sentences people to prison? Number 1. Should DAs, when they run for office, be held publicly accountable for the level of pretrial detention for, we'll say, misdemeanors held on low bail? Is that something they're responsible for in some way, reducing that number? And third, you get to pick this, maybe the easiest one for you to pick, but I'll give it to you. Should DAs in some way be responsible, although it wasn't always easy, for the level of crime in their counties? Okay. Two of you are writing. I'll give you no. I'm going to repeat them, and you get to pick which one, and it's a yes or no, and then you say why, yes or no, or maybe it's not an answer, or I'll get back to you. It's not an answer. So we're going directly to this democratic accountability question. When you run for office, and people elect you to do something, and this is the environment we live in, people say there's too many people in prison, too much, particularly low bail on low-level offenses, pretrial detention on low-level offenses, and too much crime, right? Mm-hmm. So you get to answer any one of the 3. Everyone's ready?
Yep.
Ronald, which one?
The first one.
Okay. Should DAs be held accountable for the number of people in prison, and why? And so how would they talk about that as something that they will be held accountable for?
Well, as someone who had received a 50-year sentence, I certainly feel that question. And I would say that prosecutors and their officers need to be, while they're holding people accountable and being tough on crime, be tough on results. Make sure that the people that's going to prison come back as productive citizens and not, liabilities to our.
So you would like DAs who run for office to stand up in front of the public, not just at election time, at all time, sort of an annual scorecard on the number of people they've sent to prison and see that go down?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, Cristine, you ready?
Sure.
You get to pick one of the 3. It's a yes or no, and then why?
I'd say yes to all 3, and I think there should be more. And one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, what are our performance metrics, right? So the DA has said, I'm not going to promote you based on the number of trials you do and the number of convictions you get. I'm going to promote you based on our abilities in office to advance public safety. And that looks like many different things. That can look like being in the community, working with a nonprofit. That can look like being in the courtroom, working on a case.
This is an accountability measure for the staff.
For the office, but we're...
For the office.
Right, but I think it should be published externally. I mean, we do an annual report every year. Those are some of the things we report on, but I think that there should be a larger conversation in this country about what we think successful prosecution looks like, and we should all be measured
So
against
public
the
safety
same.
is one. Your office is responsible, maybe with others, but for crime reduction, public safety in San Francisco.
At its core, I think desistance from crime of people we intervene on would be an important measure. Right? If we intervened on you, did it work? And if it didn't, then we should take that to heart and try to understand why.
So that's a recidivism measure for people who come through your system. You will be held accountable for that also?
I think we should, yes.
Okay. But you wanted to say yes to all three. We're going to come back to that
Yeah.
in a second. So, Mike, when you were running for office, if you were to step down from DCJS and stand for office again, which of these would you take?
Why would I do that?
This is the fun of this sort of daydreaming.
I'm going to take number one, but I'm not going to quite do it to your perspective. I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to say in my current position, one of the things I think about is we spend tremendous amounts of money on incarceration. And arguably not nearly enough money on some of the other things we should instead of incarceration. And it's a very interesting system where prosecutors play a huge role in deciding who goes to prison and for how long, but really are divorced from any of the financial consequences of that decision. Does that contribute to this dynamic of how much money we spend on incarceration versus how much money we spend on some of the other things?
Would you be in favor of a system that gave prosecutors sort of almost a race to the top sort of bonus if there were fewer people being sent to prison from their districts?
I think that
you see Darcel going like this?
I think that it's something we ought to think about is how do we make sure that those types of things are weighed in to the decision-making that prosecutors make before they make decisions that they want to have people sent to prison and for how long.
Okay. Carter, which one are you going to pick?
I'm yes to all three as well. But when I think of accountability, I think of the importance of people, the public, knowing the answers to all of these questions, to number of years, number of misdemeanors, crime rates in their cities, and then the public, with that information known, will determine whether what they're going to do with it. They may hear the information about years and be okay with it. They may not. But I think that it's important for the public to know all three of these.
You now run a fancy foundation, right?
Yes.
What is it? Draper, Richards,
Kaplan.
Doesn't that sound
Right.
fancy? And you fund Measures for Justice.
We do.
Right? If anybody knows Amy Bach and her Measures for Justice, right? Yeah. So are you funding them to hold county prosecutors accountable for those sorts of results? Do you think that's a reasonable measure?
Indirectly. We're funding them so that the public will know what's happening with their local criminal justice system. And what the public does with that is up to the public. And it may be that certain DA's offices and police departments are able to show we're doing great. Look at these numbers in these respects. And it may be that the public says, wait a minute, why haven't you prosecuted a domestic violence case in 15 years in this county? And we want to change that. So we consider it a neutral investment, but the public should know that information.
So Darcel, on this one, I saved you till last, just to hear from your colleagues, and you're the one, unless Mike actually does step down and runs for office again, you're the one who's up for re-election. So how do you, in terms of actual metrics on any one of these three, how do you think about it?
I think the DA is responsible in some way to, yes, as to all three. I think based on my experience now with the 18 months that I've had in there, I knew that I had to be a reformer district attorney, so no longer just arrest everybody or, make sure that bail is set, because, I understand that people should be held in jail for pending charges just because they're poor. So that's one of the things that you have to look at the fact, look at the offense, is this really a case where somebody has to sit in jail, knowing that the system that I'm a part of, the criminal justice system, although I haven't created all these problems, I have to own the fact that there's delays in sending people to trial, so they shouldn't have to sit in jail. So therefore, I need to do what I can to make sure that the process is fair and at the same time speed it up. There's a speedy trial in every, criminal case, but it's not always speedy. So to make sure, one, I keep as many people out of the system that don't have to be there. So continue prevention practices, continue diversionary practices. Stop people from coming in, especially for the low-level stuff. We can leave that out there, let the community deal with it. We are starting a neighborhood justice panels as well, and the Bronx is going to be the first in the city to do that. So, that's important. But at the same time, the process itself that the DA is involved in, making the decision as to which cases to charge, I have to also be mindful of the fact that you make sure the charges are fair and make sure that you can really prove the case. And stop the delays. Now, I inherited in a borough where there were tremendous delays. If everybody read the New York Times articles and stuff, the Bronx has the worst, record ever, low conviction rates and people waiting for their trials to happen. So that's something that I had to run on. How am I going to reduce that backlog?
Right.
And how am I going to make sure that it doesn't happen again? So I did it a two-prong approach. One, I held my staff accountable. So now, every Monday, I meet with every bureau chief, and we go over the 50 oldest cases in each bureau. And they have to report to me every week, what is going on? Is this case still viable? Do we still have witnesses? Is there evidence missing? Do we need to offer a plea? Should we dismiss? And what that causes them to have to do to drill down to the staff to make sure that they answer those questions. So we're always ready when we say we're ready in court.
So speaking of staff, and I'm wondering whether a lot of people call in sick on Monday with that accountability.
No, they're there. Yeah. They're there.
I'm sure they're there. Do you find that you're instructing your line assistants differently in terms of their requests for bail? Is this a policy matter as well as sort of an aspiration where you're actually changing the expectations as to, particularly on arraignments when
you have to. There's just too many people going in. Like, somebody should not be in jail on bail because they jumped the turnstile. I mean, that's just the way we used to do things. That there's no purpose to that now. And the judges need to be on board too. So it's not just me, it's the partners. So I make them account for the cases, especially the ones that are in jail. The first and foremost are the jail cases we make sure we take care of. Then at the same time, so that has decreased the backlog by 60% already since I've been in office 18 months. And the other thing I did was change the way that we process the cases, and I started a vertical prosecution model. So the way it was before, one assistant wrote it up in the complaint room, one assistant did the arraignment, another assistant had the case to go to grand jury, and then eventually it found itself in a trial division. Mm-hmm. That's 4 DAs. Every time another one touches it, what is this case about? Call the victim again, and it's just delays. Vertical prosecution, the one that writes it up, keeps it from beginning to end.
That's impressive.
So therefore, that's more accountability, more connection with the community. And I got to tell you, I've gone out to the community. They love the fact that I'm doing that. Mm-hmm. And it's making a difference.
Sells, yeah.
Exactly.
Carter, you get to be the first in on the next question, given what you did at the Justice Department. And this is the theme of this conference is race, public safety, the justice system, a new model for public safety, has some fancy title like that. But race is right at the center of it. And you led the effort at DOJ to look at racial disparities in the justice system. And and you found some, not surprising. And there are other DAs, Cyrus Vance, most notably here in New York City, that brought in the Vera Institute of Justice to ask the same question of the operations of his office. So just help us think about the race dimensions of the role of prosecutor. And in particular, anybody who wants to comment on this, I'm encouraging it. We saw 2 police leaders start off the conference this morning with and others on the film, with this remarkable willingness to state publicly that I think it's the words of Chuck Ramsey, that the police have been on the wrong side of racial justice and the enforcement of the law throughout history. So if we have these disparities, and you found them and others certainly have found them in the justice system, what's the role of the prosecutors, if any, for addressing those? And what do you think about this idea of some acknowledgement on their part as elected officials in our democracy that they represent a part of the system that has caused harm?
Right. So you saved the easy question for me.
Yep.
Okay. Race is extremely hard to talk about. I mean, there's nothing, yeah, that's just obvious. And I think in the terms of the role of prosecutors, as Ronald said in the very beginning, it takes courage to acknowledge that when you're sitting in the chair of leading this office that's under such public scrutiny. The Department of Justice, I think it was after the Trayvon Martin shooting, there was unrest and frustration and sadness and tragedy all over the country in response to that and the other shootings that preceded it and came after it. And I just had a sense that we at the Department of Justice had to directly respond to it, because we were getting questions along the lines of, is this an epidemic of shooting of unarmed black folks? Is this something that's on the upswing? And we couldn't answer those questions because we didn't know. Nobody had actually studied the issue. So Attorney General Eric Holder tasked us, a group of U.S. attorneys, to look at the issue and to come up with recommendations. And the reason I undertook it was for two reasons. One, the practical, which I talked about before. You have to have community trust in order to be an effective prosecutor. And if you can't address these questions about what's happening, then you're not going to get the trust. But more importantly, it was a moral issue. It was something that cut me deeply when I saw all of these things going on around the country. And I felt that DOJ should take a leadership role in addressing it. So we did that. We convened experts. We convened public defenders. We came up with the recommendations that we submitted to Attorney General Eric Holder, and he actually took some of them and incorporated a lot of them were part of the Smart on Crime initiatives that he rolled out. We can't take full credit because he was already thinking about those things, but it was reducing mandatory minimums, trying to think of alternatives to incarceration that would reduce these racial disparities. So that's a long-winded way of saying that we as prosecutors, or I guess I'm a former prosecutor, as prosecutors, because of the historical role that law enforcement played in what I would call racial oppression in this country, I do believe that we have a special responsibility to recognize it, to acknowledge it, and to the extent there are vestiges of that system and in these offices, we have to expunge them. And you can't do that without self-examination.
Ronald, same question.
That is a $1 million question, because I was just thinking, I recently was reading that 95% of the prosecutors in the United States are white. And you're asking them to look at a racial issue. That's like asking a rose to recognize its color. It's oblivious. It's like, I didn't know I was red. So I think, prosecutors have to engage in diversity and be active diversity. I like what Judge Clark said a little while ago about how she requires her staff to do these certain things on a certain day. These tasks. So once you get used to doing something, it becomes repetitive. You do it by nature. You don't have to be told to do it. And we know that, in our communities, the roles that the prosecutors have played. So I would just have to say that, that we have to be knowledgeable. That first, they're majority white. They are elected. I don't know how we can change that, but they just need to be more mindful.
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
So I want to push back on that slightly. I do believe in the importance of diversity and getting different perspectives in positions of power. That's critical. But I think it goes beyond that. I say that because in my district we had several cases of prison guards abusing inmates in too numerous times. They were black prison guards abusing black inmates. So this is an issue of that goes beyond race and goes really to oppression and humanity. So I think it is important to support the idea of diversity, but we also have to recognize that just because you have a black president or a black attorney general or a black prosecutor isn't going to by itself make a difference.
Mike, what do you think about these issues? And I was really struck by your reflection back on decisions that you made as the elected DA regarding the sweeps and the sentencing for gun offenses and the like. In essence, acknowledging that you would do things differently today, and to some extent, you put a racial lens on that. But just help us think about how you look back now, think about the role of DAs in addressing racial disparities.
Well, the first thing I was hoping for is that Carter would just keep talking so I wouldn't have to answer this question. But since he stopped, I'm embarrassed to say, but all the conversations we've had and all the times I've listened to the conversation about the role of the police in our history and in oppression, and whether police ought to acknowledge or take responsibility or apologize. This morning was the first time I ever really heard or thought about, what's the prosecutor's role in it. So I unfortunately can't say I've got this well thought out answer for you, since, as I'm embarrassed to say, it first came into my head this morning when someone said it for me. But if you go back to what I said before, the public doesn't view the individual pieces of the system separately. At least I don't think they do when it comes to their idea of whether or not the system is fair. I think they view the system, and if you are an actor in the system, you're part of that quote-unquote system. So through that lens, if one of the things that has to happen is police have to acknowledge, again, not because of any personal thing that they did necessarily, but because of the institution and what the institution has done, if police need to acknowledge and apologize to help move forward, it would make sense through that same lens that the system, may need to do the same thing, and prosecutors, as part of the system, would need to be a part of that.
What's so powerful in the stories that we hear from our police colleagues are the reactions that they get in community groups when a police chief stands up and say, I want to acknowledge the harm that my department has caused over the years. The reaction they get from community leaders is, you got me at hello, right? That we're now willing, when we talk about trust so much, we're now willing to have a different conversation. Then the challenge is, where does that go after that? But that statement can be very powerful in a community setting. And so for people who run for office, the mind exercise here is, how would that statement go over? And we'll get to Judge Clark in a second, in our community meetings, right?
How would it go over if you had the police chief and the district attorney and the chief judge and whoever else? If you had the quote-unquote system together delivering a message.
Yeah, great. So, Cristine, how do you think about this issue in your context?
So I think, you can't. It's hard to imagine escaping race when you talk about the criminal justice system. So it seems like a fundamental question to me, and I do think we collectively need to apologize for not having been on the right path for at least 30 years, at least as the war on drugs. But I think that is critical work, and I think where that will lead us to is talking about the system in general and how inhumane it is, right? No matter what your race is, inhumane. And that is the conversation I hope we can get to, and we've started to do that now around drugs as the opioid epidemic has started to hit other parts of the country and other communities. Now we're having a much gentler conversation about drugs and addiction. That's good. It's painful that it didn't happen when it was afflicting brown and black communities, but once it hit white communities, we started to have a very humane conversation about what do we do with this public health crisis. And we need to get to that place on the rest of criminal justice. And maybe race is the portal to doing that. Maybe we need to be very honest with ourselves about what we have been doing so that we can get to a place about talking about what we should be doing. And if we were to think of every single person we were interacting with as a suburban mom, maybe we would treat them differently than we do currently. But what we're doing now, I can speak for San Francisco, a liberal bastion, the line to get into the courthouse door to attend court is over 60% African American. Still, in a progressive city, every single day. And so that's bigger than us apologizing. That's dramatic systemic reform. And I think that the DA's role is, one, in accounting for our participation in that, because we inherit the police work and we push it through the process. And two, being a critical consumer of that product, right? Most DAs file everything they're brought unless there's a proof problem. Is that the best way to do your job? Or should you reject 50% of what you're brought because it's not appropriate for reasons other than proof? Because it doesn't require the system response, because you have a better way of solving that problem than a courthouse and a judge and two lawyers. And I think those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. One, are we being overtly disparate in how we treat people? And then even if we can justify the disparity based on somebody's record or the current offense, do we want to continue to have a system that is disproportionately weighing down on people of color?
So we're about to have questions and answers, so just compose your perfect, not yet. About to, I didn't say now. So we'll come to you in a second. So the final thoughts on this question from Judge Clark.
Well, I would say that as a DA, and of course as an African-American woman who lives in the same community with the people who are arrested, absolutely I know that there's a disparity. I know it. as a black woman in the community. I know it as a prosecutor. I know it as a woman who's married to a police officer. My husband is a detective. He's still on NYPD 35 years. So I recognize the disparity. I don't try to close my eyes to it. And when you're in a community such as mine, where year to date, the number of defendants that we had in the Bronx is over 20,000. 45% were black, 47% Hispanic, only 3% white. And the number of victims year to date has been a little over 8,000. 32% black, 47% Hispanic, 4.3% white. You know there's a disparity. So therefore, what as a DA can I do to mitigate that if I can't change it myself, which it takes a lot of partners to make sure you do it. But for me, that meant going out into the community, doing these diversionary measures to keep people from coming into the system now. And for those who are there are things that are holding people back now, such as these outstanding warrants for low-level, riding your bike on the sidewalk or open container of alcohol or trespassing. We have these warrant forgiveness programs. I've had the first one in the Bronx. 500 people showed up. We clear up 300 warrants. That's 300 people now that didn't have that impediment on them. First and foremost being that they could return to jail for not answering. But I'm going further than that. We, in the Bronx, there's over, there's 1.5 million of those warrants in New York City. So I'm going to go into the court in the interest of justice and just dismiss them en masse. All the warrants that are 10 years or older, and it's some 200,000 warrants. So that will help. So you know how many people, who received those summonses. So that's a way of doing it as well. And just to keep trying to think of new ideas in order to help mitigate it and forward thinking, the way we charge and everything else to make sure that we're aware of the disparity when we do the work.
Thank you. So we have time, as we hoped we would, for some questions. And you did have the first one. So you'll get the first, just wait for the microphone to come to you. You get the first question. Please state who you are so we can build networks here. And if possible, address your question to one of the panelists so that we can get one question, one answer.
Okay. My name is Kate Rivera. I run social services for Project Longevity in Bridgeport. And
say that again. You run social services for
Project Longevity in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Okay. My question is directed to Mike Green. And you mentioned earlier that you thought for the first time about the prosecutor role from the previous talk this morning. And so I just wanted to invite you and all of the people who served in that capacity, like what can you do from a leadership perspective going forward to kind of mitigate the destruction that those previous policies caused? And you don't, okay. I want you to think about it long term too. And sure. I know I'm putting you on the spot right now, but even. Well,
I just want to clarify one thing. We've been thinking a lot and for some time now about reimagining the role of the prosecutor. What I had not thought about before is the prosecutor's role in this issue of race reconciliation. That was the piece that had not been connected. But certainly, we've been doing a lot of thinking and working with the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution and others, on this idea of what's the new role of the prosecutor. But we'd love to touch base, and I think it's something we need to continue to think about. We've got a lot of work to do.
So we have another question up front here. Oh, yeah, you had one. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yep. And then
Daryl Atkinson, co-director of Forward Justice Human Rights Advocacy Organization in Durham, North Carolina. I agree with 99.9% of what Mr. Ronald Simpson-Bey says, and I've been in numerous spaces.
Can I guess that you're going to talk about the other 1%?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's be more precise, Jeremy. 0.1%.
Okay.
And it has to do with what Ronald said earlier about us having shared values. I don't believe we have shared values in our criminal justice system. At least we haven't articulated them. I think we had shared values of punitiveness, but what are the new shared values that should permeate a prosecutor's office?
Take that one on, Ronald.
Oh, you asking me? Go ahead, Cristine.
So I've been thinking a lot about this as we think about not using jails, and to me, it's about healing and restoration for everybody that's involved in a criminal incident, right? That includes the defendant, the victim, and the community as a whole. And I think we need to be developing systems that do that, because what we end up doing is taking a situation of violence and trauma and adding more violence and trauma to it, and then we say to people, be better. Right, and so it doesn't work on any side of the equation. Victims are very unhappy with most of what we do. We kind of coach them and coax them through the process of testifying, but we don't do much restoration for them. And similarly, we take a very adversarial, from the prosecutor's point of view, adversarial approach to the defendant, who is also a member of our community, rather than trying to find ways to heal what brought everybody to that situation. Accountability can still be part of that, but healing has to be a huge part of that, and it doesn't exist.
Thanks, Cristine. Next, if the microphone could come this way, right?
He flagged me as I was going.
Yeah, but Mark already had his hand up, so just come around. We'll try to get people in order. Oh, more hands going up. That's good. Do we have only the one mic? Yeah. Okay. And introduce yourself if you would.
Mark Kleiman from New York University. So we all would like to reduce the number of people in jail, and one way to do that is to replace arrests with summonses. And now we replace arrests with summonses, and people throw the summonses in the trash. And then we've got a warrant. We say, oh my God, we got all these warrants. We've got to dismiss them in the interest of justice. So now we've announced to people that you can do whatever you want and throw the summons away, and then the warrant goes away. So I'm still trying to figure out where the accountability is when somebody steals Subway service by jumping a turnstile.
Do you want to address that to somebody?
You know, the only thing is, you're a professor? Okay, NYU. The only thing is, and I could tell you this from truth to power, because I was a judge, and I saw those tickets that the cops wrote, and they were legally insufficient. So therefore, you have people being accused on a ticket, which is an accusatory instrument, so they did something wrong, so the police said. But it's not legally sufficient, so if it had gone before a judge, it would be thrown out. The city just yesterday announced that they settled for $75 million for 900,000 summonses that were written that were legally insufficient. Those are the people that went to court and that were able to fight them because they had child care, or they could miss a day from work, or whatever the case may be. Those with the warrants, I could tell you, as a judge, I presided over those cases. I dismissed so many of them because they were legally insufficient. And it was, the reason why all those warrants are there is, right, you're right. People didn't go back to court and they need to be held accountable. But if it's already legally insufficient and it was based on over-policing in certain communities, one of which is the one that I'm the DA over, then that's what we're going to have to do to balance the scales, at least mitigate the disparity. Going forward, people still make sure the police write them sufficiently. Also, the city council in the city of New York now has decriminalized those things. So now you're not going to face jail if you don't go back to court. It'll be some kind of fine or something to that effect.
So exchanges like this one can continue after we take a couple more questions. I want to get as many questions as we can into the air. Sir, you had one, and then this woman right here had one. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Ricardo Garcia Costa. You guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
City of Oakland. So it is
just hold the mic up close to you.
It is refreshing to hear that that the DAs, we're having this conversation around it. I know the police take a lot of hits around community relations, building trust. There are a lot of tangible things. I won't read off this list of a lot of stuff that working with folks on the front lines that are impacted by violence, that are impacted by the criminal justice system. There are very tangible things such as the idea of once a gang member, you're always a gang member unless you denounce your indigenous ties to your home communities, right? The exploitive nature of the bail system, the use of confidential informants at all costs, no matter what type of collateral damage happens in the community, and victim of crime benefits being held as leverage to families in order to help investigations. Those are just to name a few. But one thing I wanted to focus on today, and this is actually a question for my fellow West Coaster, go Dubs. Sorry, guys, I can't do it. Is this? I want to focus in on the idea of gang enhancements, right? in the age of social media, right? You have these alter egos that people put themselves on the internet, right? Representing, themselves as most of the times people that they're not, right?
So
And
quick,
one thing
make it a question. Make it a question.
So one thing San Francisco has that is an incredible program is the Back on Track program for first-time drug offenders, right? And I'm wondering, has there been any discussion in terms of, and maybe you might be able to speak on some of that work around that program, but is there been any discussion around expanding that program for first-time gun offenders and for first-time youngsters that are, or young adults, 18 to 24, that are getting caught up in gang enhancements,
Thank
right?
you.
Given
Like
the age
you
of
were-
social media. And
Got it. Okay, thank you.
It's like
Yes,
you were
Cristine.
planted here. This is the question I've been wanting to talk about. It's perfect. So we did, Kamala Harris, when she was the DA, started Back on Track, and when DA Gascon came in, he said it has like a 0% recidivism, which means it's too safe, right? We're not taking enough risks in it. So we said, who else should we be talking about besides people with a first-time drug sales case that could benefit from having the kind of wraparound supports that Back on Track offers? So what we did instead was we created what we call Young Adult Court, and it's for 18 to 25-year-olds, and we take almost all cases of violence. There's 69 cases in there right now. 62 of them are mostly for robberies. And most of the robberies in our city happen to be committed by African-American men, and so it is almost entirely African-American men in the program. And the idea is to give people an opportunity to earn their way out of the consequence, right? So it's a serious case. It's not one we're going to just say, no harm, no foul, proceed as you were, but we believe that there's an opportunity for a new path. And so the program is very focused on people getting an education or employment or reunited with their family, whatever those stabilizing factors are going to be or already exist for the individual. And we give them 12 to 18 months to complete those. And at the end of that, depending on what status they came into us on based on their past criminal record, then they can earn a dismissal or a reduction to a misdemeanor or other kind of earned incentive. But it's...
What about the victim?
Yeah, the victim's no part of that. This one's not restorative, so it's still in a traditional courtroom because of the severity of the
No,
offense.
I understand that, but when you make a decision about that, when you're deciding, oh, I'm going to put this young person or this person in this program, do you at least talk to the victim and let them know that that's what the disposition is or that is the plan? That's what I mean.
We do talk to them, but we don't require their approval to do it. Some programs we have require victim participation, but in this one, it's based on our evaluation of the case and what we think is an appropriate
So
consequence.
Mike wanted to step in, and then we have time
Just
for one
very
more question.
quickly, I wanted to point out one example, I think, of a DA, doing work in this space. And there's a county upstate New York where a DA is working with the other law enforcement partners on a swift, certain, and fair effort geared at young gun offenders, and trying to use probation and a swift, certain, and fair model to avoid incarceration with a very high-risk group of people that Mark has actually been involved in helping them with.
Time for one more question.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
So it's rigged, it's true. So I'm Susan Herman. I work in the New York City Police Department, and part of my portfolio is helping to develop more options for police officers. And some of these diversion programs, it's turned out, are pre-arrest diversion programs. And then some of them, I find myself pushing for that there should be a post-arrest pre-arraignment diversion program, that there's actually a role for prosecutors, and sometimes I think I don't want a police officer making certain decisions. But I have to say, the more I listen to a little bit this panel and a little bit this morning, I wonder, do you just want the police to make all the decisions, or do you want to, are there certain kinds of things, and I'm picking up a little bit on the gentleman in the back, are there shared values besides it's so costly and our caseloads are too much and we all have too much to do? Are there particular values that guide your decisions as prosecutors as to when you want to be involved in the decision? Or would you
Are you
just be
addressing
as
this
happy-
question to a person?
Anybody on the panel who wants to jump in?
Who wants to jump in?
I'm happy to.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused because on the federal side, if you're talking about diversion, it is the prosecutor's decision. Any kind of diversion. Yeah, any diversion in the federal system is the prosecutor's decision, not a line agent's. But in response to the shared values one, I do agree it needs to go beyond cost and practicality. And it's hard to legislate that, but for me, I think we need to have a shared sense of humanity. And I know that was talked about on the earlier panel, but that to me is most important, so that we see everybody, the victim, the law enforcement officer, the perpetrator, that we need to have the shared humanity so that we treat each other like we would want to be treated in terms of diversion and everything else.
Who else wants to take on this question about the relationship between police and prosecutors on diversion decisions? Cristine?
So I would prefer police to do less. In California, we passed Prop 47, which reduced punishments on drug possession and low-level theft. It's still a misdemeanor, but what happened is police generally decided it was no longer worth their while to bother with those arrests. And we have not seen a rise in crime as a result of that. So it says to me that that was a good outcome, right? We said we're going to reduce the consequences. Police said, fine, I'll focus on felony activity that's more serious than that. I think that's where we want them focused. So I think they should do less. I think they should divert. They should do things like lead when they can make an appropriate evaluation that somebody could use treatment instead of a jail cell, and they can see that when they contact the person. I think that's the right moment to do that. I think there are cases that are harder for them to tell, and sometimes where you need to intervene in the ongoing conduct in a home or on the street, and then it is a better decision to be made by the prosecutor. But I think the prosecutor has to understand that they are separate from the police and play an important function in evaluating the work of the police department and having their own charging procedures that are not just, if it is legally viable, I will charge it. It has to have something about the underlying offenses and what they think they are the appropriate intervener for. For example, we don't charge resisting arrest as a standalone charge because we are... No, one, a San Francisco jury would laugh us out of a courtroom, and two, it just tells us that there's something else happening there, and so it's just a standing practice in our office that we don't charge those. And I think offices need to have those types of benchmarks around their work so that the personnel that you assign to that doesn't feel like they're bearing the entire brunt of making a discretionary decision that the elected may not support.
Cristine, you have the final word. Join me in thanking a wonderful panel for a great discussion. Thanks so much.